بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وسيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So inshallah ta'ala, this is the second lesson regarding or about the book دروس المهمة لعامة الأمة, important lessons for the Muslim Ummah by Shaykh Abdul Aziz ibn Baz rahimahullah ta'ala. And we have reached up to lesson number 6, where we will continue inshallah. Darsu Sadis, lesson number 6, Shurutu Salah. The Shaykh says the conditions of the prayer. So a condition, the scholars they say that الشرط هو ما كان خارجا عن ماهية الشيء. A shart or a condition is something that is outside the scope of a particular worship. So a condition is anything that's outside a particular type of worship. So conditions happen or should happen before the worship takes place. Otherwise it wouldn't be called a condition. So these conditions have to be present in a person in order for their prayer or their salah to be accepted. So the Shaykh says, شُرُوطُ الصَّلَاةِ وَهِيَ تِسْعَةٌ, the conditions of the prayer, and they are 9. He says, Al-Islamu, that's the first condition, that the person has to be upon Islam, he has to be Muslim. Al-Aqlu, the person has to be of sound mind and intellect, the person has to be someone who's not insane. At-Tamyiz, the person has to be at the age of discerning or be able to distinguish. So this could happen to a child as young as 7, it could happen to a child as young as 8. And the scholars they say that the ability to differentiate or to distinguish or to discern is when a child is given some wealth or some money and he is told to buy some product or from the shop, and if he brings back the right change and he is able he knows the value of the thing that he's purchasing, then this child has reached the age of discerning. That's how you test a child, whether they've reached that age or not. Raf'ul Hadath, number 4. Raf'ul Hadath is the lifting of spiritual or symbolic impurity. It's called Raf'ul Hadath, the removal of a symbolic or ritual impurity. Izalatul Najasa, the removal of impurities, the removal of tangible impurities. That's also a shart. Satrul Awra, concealing the person's awra, and the awra of a man is between his navel and his knee. And as for a woman, then her whole body is considered to be a awra. Also from the conditions of the prayer is dukhulul waqt, is for the time of the prayer, the appointed time of the prayer to actually enter. Istiqbalul qibla, for also from the conditions of the prayer is that the person faces the qibla. And finally an-niyyatu, the intention, is also a condition of the prayer. So the person has to actually make the intention that they will pray that particular type of prayer, whether that's dhuhr, asr, maghrib, isha or fajr. So the niyyah huna, the meaning of niyyah huna, tamyizul ibadati ba'daha an ba'd. The function of the niyyah in this context is that the niyyah distinguishes between worship. So a niyyah distinguishes between dhuhr and asr, whether because they both have 4 rak'ats, وهكذا. So the niyyah isn't mentioning the actual salah. This is not called the niyyah, where some people unfortunately they fall into waswas and they say nawaytu an usalli al-dhuhr, I have made the intention of praying dhuhr or asr 4 rak'at fi masjid kada, in that particular masjid. This is something that is a bid'ah and an innovation. So the niyyah is also part of the conditions of the salah. So these 9 conditions, memorize them inshallah. They're very simple and easy to memorize. Al-Islamu wal-Aqlu wal-Tamyizu ورفع الحدث وإزالة النجاسة وستر العورة ودخول الوقت واستقبال القبلة والنية. So these are things that have to be found in a particular person in order for that person's salah and prayer to be inshallah ta'ala accepted. So they're called shurutu salah, the conditions of the prayer. And they, as we've mentioned, they happen before the actual worship takes place. So you have shurutul hajj, the conditions of hajj. You have shurutul zakah, the conditions of the zakah. So they're things that have to be found prior to the occurrence of the actual ibadah or worship. Ad-Darsu Sabi', number 7, Arkanus Salah, the pillars of the prayer. Here the Shaykh clarifies to us the pillars of the prayer. So الركن هو ما كان داخلا في ماهية الشيء. A rukun or a pillar is something that is part of the actual worship. That's the difference between a shart and a rukun. So if someone says to you, what is the difference? If there's a question, what's the difference between a rukun and a shart? You will say that a shart is something that is outside the fold of the prayers. ما كان خارجا عن ماهية, so outside the fold of a ibadah, outside the scope of a particular worship. And a rukun is something that is part of a particular worship. Okay, a rukun is something that is part of a ibadah, part of an actual particular worship. طيب. So أركان الصلاة وهي 14. The pillars of the prayer, and they are 14. القيام مع القدرة, that's the first pillar. القيام مع القدرة, to stand. Okay, it's the standing if the person is actually capable. وتكبيرة الإحرام, and the first takbirah, the takbirah in which the person actually enters the salah, which makes things that were permissible prior to the salah impermissible, and once the person says Allahu Akbar. So the first takbirah, this is called takbiratul ihram. This is a rukun and a pillar of the salah. Also qira'atul Fatiha, reciting Surah Al-Fatiha, is also a pillar of the salah, because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that whoever doesn't recite Surah Al-Fatiha, then his prayer is nullified. فَصَلَاتُهُ خِدَاج, then his prayer is nullified. Also, the pillars of the prayer also consist of ruku', making ruku', and then also وَالْإِعْتِدَالُ بَعْدَ الرُّكُوعِ, and from the pillars of the prayer is to do the ruku' properly, to make the ruku' in a proper fashion, and that means basically that the person's back is straight. And if you were to put a cup on top of the person's back, then that cup would balance on his back and wouldn't basically topple over. So that's al-i'tidalu ba'da al-ruku'. طيب. So with ruku', that's how the person does ruku'. Al-i'tidalu ba'da al-ruku' is after the person does ruku', the person should stand upright. Al-i'tidalu ba'da al-ruku' is for the person to stand upright. Okay, that's the meaning of al-i'tidalu ba'da al-ruku'. So standing upright after the ruku' is also from the pillars of the prayer. And then the Shaykh says, وَالسُّجُودُ عَلَى الْأَعْضَاءِ السَّبْعَةِ, and also from the pillars of the prayer is to make sujood upon the 7 limbs. Upon the 7 limbs. That's also part of sujood. Okay, that's also part of the pillars of prayer. Does anyone know the 7 limbs that the Shaykh is talking about? على الأعضاء السبعة. Can anyone tell me these 7 limbs that the Shaykh is talking about? Okay, so the 2 hands, that's 2. The forehead, 3. Nose 4. The knees, okay, that's 5, 6. The toes, which toes, the right or the left? Both, that's 8. We have 8. So that means we have something extra.
The nose and the forehead together.
Yeah, the nose, the face, that's all together. Yeah, that's all together. So the nose, you don't have to, the forehead, that's all you need to say. And obviously the nose and the forehead, the face basically, that's together, inshallah. طيب. So والسجود على الأعضاء السبعة, and then والرفع منه. So after the sujood, to lift your face from the ground is also part of the pillars of the salah. And then والجلسة بين السجدتين, and to sit between the pause, the sitting between the 2 sujoods is also part of the pillar. Is also a pillar. And then والطمأنينة في جميع الأفعال, and to feel tranquil and tranquility, and to be comfortable and to feel at ease in all of the actions, and all of these af'al, all of these actions and all of these pillars is in itself a pillar. والترتيب بين الأركان, and to perform these pillars in the order that they are presented in here. to perform these pillars in that particular tartib, in that particular order, is also a rukun. والتشهد الأخير, and to say at-tashahhud, which is to say at-tahiyyatu lillahi, the final sitting, and the prayer that you say in the final sitting is in itself a rukun. وَالْجُلُوسُ لَهُ, and to the sitting all itself. So tashahhud al-akhir is the saying at-tahiyyatu lillahi was-salawatu at-tayyibatu. This in itself is a rukun, and the sitting for that tashahhud is in itself a rukun. Okay, and the sitting is in itself a rukun. And then the Shaykh says, وَالصَّلَاةُ عَلَى النَّبِيِّ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم, and to send peace and salutations upon the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم is in itself a rukun. And وَالتَّسْلِيمَتَانِ, and the two taslims, to say assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, the two taslims is in itself a rukun. Type. So here you have 14 rukun or 14 pillars. So what is the fa'idah and the thamara of knowing what a rukun is and knowing what a condition is? What do we benefit from being able to distinguish between a pillar and between a shart? Does anyone know? What do we benefit?
You wouldn't have to pray properly, because the salah have to be accepted.
Okay, knowing, but then why didn't the Shaykh mention all of them at once in one particular place? And why didn't he say these are the arkan and the shurut of the salah? And he included all 14 pillars and all 9 conditions in one breath, in one chapter or in one lesson. Why did he have to make it 2 different lessons?
Because the conditions is what you need to do before you perform your prayer.
Okay, and the pillars?
The pillars are part of your prayer, so if you didn't know that, then you could have done it in any order, before or after. Like the fact that it's distinguished between the two corrects your prayer. Exactly.
But what if what if he could have said to you that some of them, he could have said to you that make sure you do some of them before the prayer and some of them inside the prayer, and he would have still. But how does this affect our prayers when it comes to making mistakes?
And what was your question?
The question is distinguishing between a rukun and a shart. How does that affect our prayers, especially when it comes to making mistakes? I'll make it simple. If I abandon a shart, a condition, and then I pray, what is the ruling on my salah? So let's go back to the shart. Okay, it's on the board. Okay, if someone prays without having Islam, and he has everything else, al-aql, tamyiz, raf' al-hadath, he does the arkan perfectly, what's the ruling on their prayer? It's not accepted. The ruling on their prayer is that it's not accepted. Okay? If they pray without having Islam, or aql, or tamyiz, or raf' al-hadath, or any of them, they pray, or someone prays without properly covering themselves, they're half naked or they're even naked, is their prayer accepted? The answer is no, their prayer is not accepted. Their prayer is not accepted. طيب. That's the shurut out of the way. What about the arkan? I'm going to ask you now the arkan after we finish the lesson number 8. Okay? So the question that's going to come after question 8 to let you know beforehand is, what's the ruling if a person abandons a rukun? We know that if a person abandons a shart, a condition, their salah is batil. It's not accepted. Okay, their salah is not accepted. طيب. Question, Dars al-Thamin, lesson number 8, Wajibatu Salah, the obligations of the prayer. Now we move on to the obligations of the prayer. So the conditions of the prayer we know, the pillars of the prayer we know. Now we move on to Wajibatu Salah, the obligations of the prayer. So the Shaykh rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, Wajibatu salatu wa hiya thamaniya, the obligations of the prayer, and they are 8. Okay, Jami'u takbirati ghayra takbirat al-ihram. All of the takbirat, takbir means to say Allahu Akbar, all of the takbirat except the first takbir, they are all considered to be min wajibat as-salah, from the wajibat or the obligations of the prayer. طيب. That's the first one. وَقَوْلُ سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ, and saying سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ for the imam and for the person praying on their own. وَالْمُنْفَرِدِ. This is very specific, okay? So saying سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ for the Imam, يعني the Imam saying سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ, and the person, whether they be male or female, it doesn't matter, and the person praying on their own, they both have to say سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ. Okay? وَقَوْلُ, what about the person praying behind the Imam? The Shaykh says وَقَوْلُ رَبَّنَا وَلَكَ الْحَمْدُ, and saying رَبَّنَا وَلَكَ الْحَمْدُ for all of them. This is also from the wajibat of the prayer. So all of them, the Imam, the person praying on their own, and obviously the person praying behind the Imam, they all have to say رَبَّنَا وَلَكَ الْحَمْدُ.
So you have to say, has to say سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ رَبَّنَا وَلَكَ الْحَمْدُ.
Yeah, سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ رَبَّنَا وَلَكَ الْحَمْدُ.
Praying on your own.
Sorry?
Even if you're praying on your own.
Yeah, even if you're praying on your own. Because the scholars, they say, that's a good question, Ayan. The scholars, they say that when you say سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ, okay, even if you're praying on your own, then there are angels that are present with you. There are angels that are present with you. So you say سَمِعَ اللَّهُ, Allah listens to the person who praises Him, لِمَنْ حَمِدَ, and then you say رَبَّنَا وَلَكَ الْحَمْدُ. Okay, and obviously you are part of the person that Allah hears when He praises Him. طيب. You also طيب ربنا ولك الحمد للكل. Then he says وقول, and also saying سبحان ربي العظيم في الركوع. Saying سبحان ربي العظيم in ruku' is also an obligation. Once, saying it once is an obligation. More than once, twice, 3 times, it's sunnah. It's nawafil. We'll come to that later on.
Does it have to be odd number? Can be any number?
It should be witr. It should be 3 times the sunnah. Saying it 3 times is the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. طيب. And then the Shaykh says وَقَوْلُ سُبْحَانَ رَبِّيَ الْأَعْلَى فِي السُّجُودِ, and saying سُبْحَانَ رَبِّيَ الْأَعْلَى in sujood is also wajib, is an obligation.
Is that once again?
Yeah, once again, same thing, yeah. وَقَوْلُ, and then saying رَبِّ اغْفِرْ لِي, oh Allah, forgive me, between the 2 sujoods. Yani when you make sujood and then you get up, there's a little pause. Saying رَبِّ اغْفِرْ لِي, this is the minimum amount that's required. There's also a dua, you can say رَبِّ اغْفِرْ لِي وَارْحَمْنِي وَاجْبُرْنِي وَاعْفُ عَنِّي, الدعاء المعروف. Okay, that's also extra. But the minimum requirement is for you to say رَبِّ اغْفِرْ لِي.
Is that once?
Once, yes, once. And a tashahhud al-awwal, the first tashahhud is also an obligation. And that's the tashahhud where you stop at ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, and then you get up for the 3rd rak'ah.
So if you add the dua for the Rasul Ibrahim, it's not, you don't do that.
You stop at ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, and then you get up. And adding the dua for the Prophet and Ibrahim, as dua salat Ibrahim, that's for tashahhud al-akhir, that's for the final tashahhud. طيب. And the al-julus lahu, and sitting for that particular tashahhud is also an obligation. Is also an obligation.
Is that the first tashahhud?
Yeah, that's the first tashahhud, yeah. Sitting for the actual sitting for that tashahhud is also an obligation. Now we get to the next question, the question that I was supposed to ask you previously, which is, now we know the wajibat, we know the obligations of the prayer, and we know the arkan or the pillars of the prayer, okay? What is the difference between the two, in the sense that, what happens if I abandon a rukun? If I abandon one rukun of the prayer, what's the ruling on this? And I don't, for example, stand for prayer, or I don't do takbirat al-ihram, I don't say Allahu Akbar for Maghrib, I just literally remain silent and do this. I'm running to catch the Imam. This is a mistake, a common mistake a lot of people make. And Sheikh Mashhur Al-Salman, one of the students, famous Sheikh, he lives in Jordan, one of the students of Sheikh Al-Albani rahimahullah ta'ala. He has a book called Akhta' al-Musallin, common mistakes that many people or the people who pray make. And he mentions in that book that there's some people, what they do is they come inside the masjid and the Imam is in the ruku'. So in their haste to catch the Imam in the ruku', they forget to say Allahu Akbar, and they just join the Imam within their ruku', literally join the Imam in their ruku'. and they don't even say Allahu Akbar. And when the Imam says Sami' Allahu liman hamdi, they say Rabbana wa lakal hamd. They forgot to say Allahu Akbar. That salah doesn't even count. That salah is batil. And if they knew the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in a hadith, in an athar by Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, you can actually, if the saf or the front row, if the rows of the Imam is far away from you, and you are afraid that if you walk, you're going to miss the ruku', the Imam is going to get up before you even get to the saf, to get to the row, you can make ruku', as soon as you enter the masjid, you can make ruku', you can say Allahu Akbar, make ruku' and walk while you're making ruku' to the saf. And this is also a sunnah that many people have abandoned. طيب. Anyway, so what is the ruling? Back to the question. If I abandon one rukun, does anyone know?
Some of these rukun pillars are linked to the obligations of Salah. So if you miss a pillar, then...
No, they're not. What do you mean they're linked?
Well, if, like, for example, the one says ruku', when you make ruku', then an obligation of the prayer tells you what to say during ruku'.
Okay. Yeah, but when you say linked, I want to understand what you mean by linked. Do you mean by linked they're the same, or?
No. I mean, like, you need to do the pillar, and then the obligations of the salah comes after.
Yes, but there's a difference between the two. There's a rukun, like a rukun. There's no single pillar that's similar to a single wajib. They're different.
No, what I mean is, like, you do a pillar and then it's followed with an obligation.
Okay, so what if, my question is, forget the obligation. What if I abandon a pillar? I do not do a pillar. I fail to perform a pillar.
You know the pillars and the conditions. What I understand, the conditions, every Muslim knows. So you have to be Muslim. You have to.
You mean the obligations or the conditions that we finished? You're talking about this lesson 6?
Yeah. We'll go back to lesson 6.
Okay.
Every Muslim knows that you have to be at age 8. Age 7, you have to pray and be Muslim, all that stuff. But you know the parts where it's the pillars, where you have to say certain things when you're getting up, when you're moving, but sometimes you forget. Like you said, some people abandon the sunnah and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But isn't it something that people learn and then perfect? You can always perfect it and fix it, where if, let's say, you're not a Muslim, then your salah does not.
No, but it's upon every Muslim to learn how to pray, because praying is obligatory. If there is an obligatory act that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed upon our shoulders and burden upon us, then anything that it's from common sense, that anything that helps us to perfect that obligatory act is in itself an obligation. So having knowledge of the salah is an obligation. مَا لَا يَتِمُّ الْوَاجِبُ إِلَّا بِهِ فَهُوَ وَاجِبٌ. That which is a necessity to implement or to apply an obligation is in itself an obligation. So a Muslim they know that salah is wajib, so it's upon them to learn how to pray. That's ignorance. Their ignorance is not an excuse. يعني هذا العذر يعني هذا الجهل لا يعذر. Their ignorance is not an excuse, because they know that their salah has to be perfect, their salah has to be upon the sunnah, so they have to learn. Okay, so getting back to the question, what happens if I abandon a rukun?
So your salah is nullified.
Okay, but you're supposed to ask me another question, which is, did I abandon that rukun intentionally or unintentionally? That's the second question. Okay, so there's a difference between abandoning something intentionally or unintentionally. طيب. If a person abandons, the principle is, if a person abandons or does not implement or perform a pillar or a wajib, okay, and they abandon it intentionally, then their salah is batil, then their salah is nullified, and it could lead to that person, it could lead to apostasy.
But Ma'alim, that's
okay.
what we're talking about. Some people do not know that they're doing
it. We're coming to that. That's the second bit, inshallah. We're coming to it. So if a person abandons it intentionally, yani on purpose, a pillar or a wajib, on purpose, they know it's a rukun, and they still can't be bothered to stand for prayer, for example, they just sit down for salatul, for example, they feel a bit tired, so they sit down and pray dhuhr, okay, or asr. It has to be an obligatory prayer, طبعا. We'll come to the nawafil, that's in another book, we'll learn that inshallah. But for the obligatory prayer, if they sit down, for example, while knowing that they have to stand up, that salah is batil. Okay? And similarly a wajib as well. Similarly a wajib. Now we come to the person unintentionally abandoning a rukun. So if a person forgets to do a rukun, unintentionally means ignorance. It could be out of ignorance. It could be it could be out of nisyan, forgetfulness. Al-muhim, they abandon it. They don't do it. But they don't do it on purpose. So the ulama, the scholars, they say that if that person, that salah, as soon as that person remembers or learns it afterwards, then it is upon them to repeat that particular pillar. Now the proof of this is the hadith of Dhul Yadayn. This is the famous hadith, and the Prophet ﷺ was praying, and he did not pray. He was praying and he forgot to pray the last 2 rak'ats. He made taslim ﷺ after 2 rak'ats, and the people thought that some revelation came down and the salah has been shortened. So a man went to the Prophet ﷺ. When the Prophet ﷺ finished the salah, he went and he went to a pillar in the masjid and he leant on that pillar. And a man who had very long hands, he's known as Dhul Yadayn, he went to the Prophet ﷺ and said to him, Ya Rasulullah, qusirat as-salah, has the salah been shortened? And the Prophet said ﷺ, no, it hasn't. And then he told the Prophet ﷺ that he did not pray, or he made taslim, and that there's 2 rak'ats remaining. And then the Prophet looked at Abu Bakr and he said to him, is he correct? And they said yes. And then the Prophet ﷺ went back and finished the prayer, and he continued and prayed those 2 rak'ats. And then afterwards he made sujood al-sahw. He prostrated the prostration of forgetfulness. So here the scholars, they derive from this hadith that if a person abandons a pillar, okay, then that person has to repeat that pillar, has to do that pillar. They don't necessarily have to fulfill the whole salah, okay, but they have to repeat that actual rak'ah. So if they didn't recite Surah Al-Fatiha, they forgot to recite Surah Al-Fatiha, and they're praying dhuhr, in 1 rak'ah in dhuhr they forgot to recite Surah Al-Fatiha, technically they only prayed 3 rak'ats, provided that they recited Surah Al-Fatiha in the other 3. So if they remember afterwards, they have to perform that rak'ah. They have to get up and perform that rak'ah whereby they recite Surah Al-Fatiha, and then they do sujood al-sahw afterwards. Na'am.
Sheikh, what if you say you missed a rak'ah but you can't remember for sure? You're not sure, but
if you've missed a rak'ah,
like you finish the salah but you feel like you've missed maybe 1 rak'ah you didn't make,
then you do sujood al-sahw.
You just do
Sujood al-sahw, because you cannot remember which pillar that you've missed.
Yeah.
You know you've missed a pillar, but you don't know which pillar you've missed.
Yeah.
So technically you can't be told to which one are you going to repeat. You don't know, so you do sujood al-sahw. You pray sujood al-sahw, but you have to be careful with waswas as well. And some people they have waswas, and the shaitan whispers to them all the time that they've missed something in their salah and they haven't. And every salah they always have this waswas, so that's also very dangerous as well. So if you're someone who doesn't have waswas, then do sujood al-sahw. If you have someone who you have waswas, then do not do sujood al-sahw, but rather don't do anything in order to fight the shaitan and his whispers. So that's regarding a pillar. Okay, that's what you have to do for a pillar. As for abandoning a wajib unintentionally, out of forgetfulness or ignorance or whatever, then the scholar, and then if the person remembers, okay, if the person remembers in the salah, if the person remembers while they are praying, so they are praying asr, and in the 4th rak'ah, they remembered in the 1st rak'ah that they forgot to say Sami Allahu liman hamida. So they forgot to say Sami Allahu liman hamida in the 1st rak'ah. What they do is they continue praying as usual, and then when they come to the last tashahhud al-akhir, and they are about to make taslim, okay, they make sujood twice, the sujood of forgetfulness, okay, and then they make taslim. Okay, and then they make taslim.
So the only difference between them two is that they don't have to go and do it again.
Yeah, but I'm coming to it. So if the person remembers after making taslim, so say you're praying Asr, you remembered after you finished Salat al-Asr, you're still in your musalla, you're making tasbih, subhanallah, alhamdulillah, la ilaha illallah akbar, you're making tasbih, and you remembered, subhanallah, you forgot to say Sami Allah liman hamida in the first rak'ah. The scholars, they say you make sujood al-sahw. You even though you've technically left the salah, you make sujood al-sahw, you prostrate twice. Okay, you prostrate yourself, you prostrate twice out sujood, the sujood of forgetfulness. That's afterwards. Yani. Now.
Is there a particular dua you recite that?
Yes, there is. It's in Hisn al-Muslim. For the sujood of forgetfulness, you say you say Subhan Rabbi al-A'la as usual, and you can say Sajada wajhi lilladhi khalaqahu wa sawwarahu wa shaqqa sam'ahu wa basarahu. It's in Hisn al-Muslim. If you've in Hisn al-Muslim, look for the sujood of forgetfulness. I'm not sure if that dua was for sujood al-tilawa, for the recitation of the Quran, or sujood or the sujood of forgetfulness, but check Hisn al-Muslim inshallah. But you have to say Subhan Rabbi al-A'la. So in that sense, that's the difference between a rukun, a pillar, and a wajib. So if a person abandons a pillar, the main difference is important. The main difference between a pillar and a wajib and an obligation is that an obligation can be rectified with sujood al-sahw. An obligation can be rectified with sujood al-sahw alone. You don't have to technically repeat that obligation that you've abandoned. Whereas in a rukun, in a pillar cannot be rectified by sujood al-sahw. A pillar has to be repeated. Okay, it has to be repeated. That's the difference between a pillar and a wajib and an obligation. Alhamdulillah.
I've got 7, not 8 maybe, because I missed.
You've got what? Sorry?
I've got 7 obligations.
There's 8 obligations. Yeah. Which one do you have? Tell me which ones you have. First, count them from 1 to 7.
All of the takbir except the first one I've considered to be an obligation.
Sorry?
All of the takbir
except
the first one.
That's one.
I'll consider to be obligation. Yeah. Saying Sami Allah Hamida.
2.
Like saying Sami Allah regardless of whether you're the Iman or by yourself.
Saying Sami Allah liman hamda for the Imam and the person praying on their own. Munfarid. Okay, that's 2.
Saying Subhanallah Rabbil Adim.
No, you've missed out Rabbana wa lakal hamd. Number 3, saying Rabbana wa lakal hamd for all of them. All of them have to say Rabbana wa lakal hamd. So now you should have 8. Is that the same one you missed out as well?
No, I've got that one.
Okay, continue from that one then. Number 4.
Wait, no, actually I just wrote my numbers wrong, sorry.
Okay. طيب الدرس التاسع. Okay, الدرس التاسع, number 9, lesson number 9. The Shaykh here will clarify at-Tashahhud. Okay, the Shaykh here is going to clarify at-Tashahhud. بيان التشهد وهو التحيات. Okay, this is how you say at-Tahiyyat. Okay, the meaning of at-Tahiyyat, I think it's in Hisn al-Muslim. You can all check the meaning. So now what we'll concentrate on is actually how to actually say it and pronounce it properly. So the Shaykh says at-Tahiyyatu, the way to say at-Tahiyyat is at-Tahiyyatu lillahi was-salawatu wat-tayyibatu assalamu alayka ayyuhan nabiyyu wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu assalamu alayna wa ala ibadillahi salihin ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Okay, and this is the end of the first tashahhud, the first portion of the tashahhud. Now,
So, understand. An obligation. If you forget to read Fatiha, then after you finish your prayer, you pray 2 rak'ahs.
Mm-hmm.
And then for a pillar, let's say...
No. Say that again. An obligation or a pillar?
An obligation.
Okay. So repeat your sentence again. Say.
So if you forgot to read Surah Al-Fatiha in one of your prayers...
Okay, Surah Al-Fatiha is a pillar.
A pillar.
Yes. Arkanus Salah. It's a pillar. Don't mix up your conditions from your pillars, from your obligations. Make sure you know what a pillar is. In the exam I'm going to ask you, is reciting Surah Al-Fatiha a condition or an obligation or a pillar? Okay? So reciting Surah Al-Fatiha is a pillar.
So if I forget to recite Surah Al-Fatiha,
okay,
I do it again in the next prayer.
Not in the next prayer, no.
No, next time I pray.
Not next time you pray, as soon as you remember.
As soon as I remember.
Yeah, whether that's after 5 minutes or after 5 years. As soon as you remember.
So if I forget and then I finish my prayer and then I remember that I did not say Surah Al-Fatiha.
Yes.
Then I pray again.
You pray 1 rak'ah.
1 rak'ah.
Yeah, you pray that rak'ah that you did not pray that you did not recite Surah Al-Fatiha in.
Okay.
Okay? And then you make sujood al-sahw. And that rak'ah goes towards that asr or that dhuhr or that prayer that you did not recite Surah Al-Fatiha in. Okay? So a rukun has to be repeated. If you abandon a pillar, you have to repeat that pillar. Is that clear?
Does that mean that every pillar that you abandon, you have to pray 1 extra prayer?
You have to make up that pillar. And the only way to make up that pillar is to pray 1 rak'ah. You cannot sit down and say, I'm going to read Surah Al-Fatiha and say, okay, that goes towards that. No. You have to say Allahu Akbar and pray as normal, that particular rak'ah, 1 rak'ah, 1 unit of prayer. Okay?
An obligation, which is Allahu Akbar.
Yeah, an obligation, an example of obligation is saying Allahu Akbar, all the takbirat of ihram except the first one. Remember, the first one is what? What's the first one? It's a pillar. Any Allahu Akbar after the first Allahu Akbar is a wajib, is an obligation. Okay?
So if I forget to say the first Allahu Akbar, which is the obligation.
If you forget to say the first Allahu Akbar, then you have abandoned a
condition, an obligation.
No. A pillar. You've abandoned a pillar.
But it's also an obligation.
No. An obligation is every Allahu Akbar after the first Allahu Akbar. So let me give you an example. Okay, listen. Forget your notes. Okay, I am praying dhuhr now. Okay, imagine I am praying dhuhr. The first thing you do is you make wudu, obviously. Okay, and you say, how do I enter the salah? How do I enter the state of prayer? What do I do? Okay, I've made the intention. Then what? Sorry? I say Allahu Akbar, yes? So I say Allahu Akbar. Okay, this Allahu Akbar, this is called Takbiratul Ihram. The first Allahu Akbar is called Takbiratul Ihram. So if I abandon this Allahu Akbar, okay, and say I want to pray dhuhr, I just do this. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim Maliki Yawmiddin. I just recite Surah Al-Fatiha. I haven't said Allahu Akbar. Technically, I have not even entered the salah. I am not a musalli, technically. Do you understand? So, imagine I pray dhuhr as usual. And then subhanAllah afterwards I remember, I forgot to say Allahu Akbar. It happens. Sometimes the shaitan comes, you remember anyway. Then, what do? I get up and I pray. Some scholars, they say you should repeat the whole prayer again. Others, they say you should repeat that particular rak'ah. But for Takbiratul Ihram, some scholars, they say because it's Takbiratul Ihram and you haven't technically entered the prayer, everything that happens afterwards is batil, is nullified. So you have to actually repeat that whole prayer. So Al-Ahwat, and the safest option is to repeat the whole prayer, especially when it's Takbiratul Ihram. Okay? Because Takbiratul Ihram is the signal and it's the indication of you, it's an indication of you actually entering the ibadah or the worship of prayer. You understand? Okay? So make sure you memorize and you know what your pillars are and you know what your conditions are and you know what your wajibat are. Is that clear? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, now.
Should I just say after you read the witr?
If you what, sorry?
The witr salah. And after doing the salam, you just remember you've got to do the dua. with the dua qunut, how would you read that?
So you're in the middle of the salah and you remembered?
No, after completing it, but you've got to read dua qunut after doing this salam.
Okay, so after you've completed your prayer, and then what? You want to do qunut.
You've forgotten to read it, and then so how do you?
But the qunut, is it a pillar? Is it an obligation? Remember, there are some madahib, some schools of thought that consider some aspects that are not mentioned here to be a pillar or a condition or a prayer. The reason the Shaykh has made this list, okay, is for you to make it's easier for you. Okay, if you for example if you believe, for example, that the qunut is a wajib and you have a proof or evidence, then depending on where you put it, if you put it in the wajibat, then you do exactly what I've just mentioned. If you abandon the qunut, okay, then what do you do? Answer my question. If say qunut was a wajib, what do you do? Qunut is Allahumma hadina fi man hadayt wa afina fi man afayt wa tawallana fi man tawallayt. The dua of qunut. And the scholars rahimahumullah ta'ala, they say that the dua of qunut, the imam should do this dua when there's nawazil, when the Muslims are afflicted with a major calamity, and he should do it in Salat al-Fajr, for example, just like the Prophet ﷺ did when some calamities and masaib happened to the Muslims in Medina. The Prophet used to do qunut. So her question was, if I abandon the qunut, what should I do? So my answer is, depending on what you believe the qunut is, you make it up in accordance with what you think the qunut is. Is it a wajib or a rukun or a shart? Obviously it's not going to be a shart. Is it a wajib or a rukun? Do you understand my answer? Okay? So according to the jumhur, or the majority of the scholars, that the qunut is a sunnah, and it's a sunnah and it's used for certain situations, and it's not a sunnah that you do continuously every single salah fajr. You do it in certain situations when the Muslims are for example are being attacked by an enemy, or when a musibah, a calamity, a plague happens to a particular part of the Muslim Ummah, and the Imam makes dua for them, and he prays the Salatul Qunut. It's in Hisnul Muslim.
Is it not read in Isha?
Sorry?
In Isha, Salah and Witr.
It's in Fajr. Usually it's in Fajr.
In Isha.
And there's differences of opinion in which Salah it is. It could be in Isha, it could be in Fajr. There's هناك خلاف على أي حال. But it's in a particular prayer. Whether it's in Fajr or Isha, it doesn't really matter. If it's something that's done continuously, the scholars they say it's not part of the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and al-mudawama ala al-qunut, to continuously do the qunut, whether that's for Isha or Fajr. But they say that it should be done in specific situations. As for the salah, na'am.
Did you mean witr? Is that what you mentioned first?
Yeah.
Witr.
But the witr, are you talking about the qunut where the imam does the qunut for the person? The person who prays witr on their own.
Yeah.
Witr on their own.
Isha,
After Isha.
Yeah, after Isha.
Okay, that's now I understand. طيب. Now, if the person prays qunut on their own, qunut is not a wajib or it's not a rukun. Okay? And if they abandon qunut, then they don't have to repeat the witr. Do you understand? Part of the conditions of witr is not to make qunut. Do you understand? It's not a shart and a condition of witr to make qunut. But it's it's mustahab, and it's something that's recommended to do, to make qunut in witr. But if you abandon qunut, then you don't have to basically repeat your witr. Okay, you don't have to repeat your witr. طيب. So let's continue, inshallah. Does everyone understand now? Or is there any aspect of what we've mentioned that you have not understood?
Shaykh, so the conditions and the pillars, does that mean they're greater in importance than the obligation?
You mean are the pillars greater? Yes, obviously, yeah, the pillars are greater in importance than the obligations, because a pillar cannot be rectified, like we said, without repeating it. You can't rectify it with sujood al-sahw, whereas in The wajibat or the obligations, you can rectify them with sujood al-sahw.
Is that also because if you miss some of the pillars, then you can also miss some of the obligations, which is what I was.
If you what?
If you miss like a pillar, you can also miss an obligation because.
No, it's not necessary. No, I know where you're coming from, because some of them, I know where you're coming from. You're basically saying that they're all linked, they're all next to each other. Like Allah, the first Allah, but then that's not necessarily true.
No, if you make, for example, when you make the court, then that's a pillar sahw.
Yes.
Then one of the conditions on
it's saying Sami Allah liman hamida. Okay.
So if you miss a pillar, then you can also miss a condition. Because a condition.
It can happen.
So
Yeah, it can happen.
Like
it can happen. Yeah. It can happen. Yeah. So if you, that's
that. Then you haven't done that. If you haven't done the ruku', then you haven't said Sami Allah liman hamida.
It could happen. Someone might miss the ruku' and then, as they're standing, say Sami Allah liman hamida. It can technically happen. They might forget that they've done the ruku'.
Yeah.
It happens. But if it does happen, what's the ruling? If a person misses a wajib and a rukun, that's a good point. What do we do then? If a person misses both, unintentionally, he forgets a wajib and a rukun at the same time. طيب. What do you think happens? You said you should pray again. Okay, say the person missed, like Fatima said, a person misses, abandons the ruku' and Sami Allah liman hamida, misses both of them entirely. Yeah, they do the rak'ah again. The person performs the rak'ah again, and then what? And makes sujudu as-sahw. And that rectifies the problem, inshallah. طيب. نقف عند هذا الحد. We're going to stop here to pray Maghrib, and then we'll continue after Maghrib, inshallah. صلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.